So today we're going to be talking about boundaries. And when we think about the last couple of days, when we think about colonialism, one of the legacies or one of the impacts of colonialism on our world is that many of our boundaries between different countries today are a result of the colonial period. Definitely not all, but many of those boundaries that were created by colonial powers still exist today. So we're going to talk about different types of boundaries today, and we're going to put them into different categories. And then over the next couple days, starting on Thursday, we're going to be taking a look at different regions in the world that have boundary disputes, where there is conflict over who owns what land, or there's conflict over the boundaries. So just to get us all started with a definition of what a boundary is a boundary is an infinitely thin, invisible, imaginary line that brings two separate states into direct conflict. So I think we all understand what a boundary is. You know, one day you are in the United States, you walk, and now you're in Canada. And at some point, you cross over that boundary where you are no longer in the United States, you are now in Canada. Or, for example, you may have been to another state. So you go from Minnesota and you get to a point where you see a sign that says, welcome to Wisconsin, or wherever it may be. Boundaries are not always marked. But many boundaries are. Some boundaries have walls or fences or other sort of ways that you know that you are crossing over a boundary. Sometimes it's just signs, but boundaries definitely don't need to have any markation either. But with that, a boundary is more than just a line on the ground. A boundary is an entire plane. So if this is country A over here, this is country B over here, the boundary actually goes all the way down into the earth and all the way up into the airspace up overhead. And so that's important because many countries have resources, really valuable resources underneath the ground. And so if you have something underneath your country, then that is technically yours. You can mine that, you can drill for that, whether that be oil, or your airspace is something that you protect. So the boundary doesn't just fall on the ground; it is also goes up into the air and down beneath the earth. The first type of boundary we're going to talk about is our natural or physical boundaries. Many boundaries throughout the world are created from physical features on the Earth's surface. These types of boundaries are usually created by mountain ranges, deserts, and bodies of water. And boundaries that are created by natural and physical features oftentimes feel that way. They feel natural. They feel like an easy way to designate where one country is and where another country is. So here are some examples. The Himalayan mountains, which is the highest mountain range in the world, separates India and China, and falls Nepal and Bhutan also fall within the Himalayan mountains. So it forms this natural break. And if you think historically, the people of India and the people of China are isolated from each other. You know, mountain ranges are not easily passed, especially ones as high as the Himalayas. And so people developed, or different cultures developed in isolation, and they developed different traits. They developed different cultural traits and languages and religions. And when they actually went around to actually deciding where that boundary was going to be, it seemed only natural that we would create the boundary where that boundary kind of had always been. A desert can serve as a boundary. And so here's the Himalayan mountains here, but the Gobi Desert serves as a boundary because a lot of times people don't live in vast deserts, it can serve as a natural boundary between, for example, Mongolia and China here. And then the chain of Great Lakes separates the United States and Canada. The Rio Grande River separates the United States and Mexico for a good portion of the boundary. And so rivers are really common physical boundaries as well. A geometric boundary is a boundary that are drawn straight. If you see a straight line on a map, you can assume it's not going to be a physical or a natural feature. Rivers don't ever run exactly straight. So a geometric boundary is usually oftentimes used as a line of latitude or longitude, and people whoever had power to create those boundaries just decided, hey, we're just going to make it easy. We're going to draw this line here, and we're going to use this line to separate, in this case, the United States and Canada. So we talked about this boundary between the United States and Canada of the chain of Great Lakes. or the Great Lakes system. But this boundary between the United States and Canada was formed as an agreement between the British and the Americans as to where to form the boundary west of the Mississippi, essentially, and said we're just going to form it on the 49th degree north latitude line, and that's just going to be where our treaty is going to be drawn. Africa, as you notice, has a number of geometric, very straight boundaries, and these boundaries were drawn. Many of these boundaries were drawn up during that Berlin conference that we talked about yesterday. So, geometric boundary are the ones that are just straight lines. Cultural boundaries, on the other hand, are boundaries that are created because of some human difference. So not because necessarily a physical difference between or physical feature, and definitely probably not a straight line, but they're because of human differences. So because people had developed different cultures, there might be a division between different religions. So, for example, India and Pakistan, prior to 1949, the British colony of India, or 1948, the British colony of India included what is modern day India and Pakistan. And then a couple of years after independence, there was a partition, which just means they broke apart between India and Pakistan. And part of that was due to religious differences between the people. And so Indians are predominantly Hindu, and Pakistan they're predominantly Muslim. Language boundaries, so people speak different languages. It might make sense to draw a boundary between the group of people who speak German versus Polish. And then different ethnic groups, people who have the same shared history, might demand that they have their own country, and they draw boundaries around where their people live. And so an example, a lot of the boundaries in Europe are cultural boundaries. However, you can also find a lot of physical boundaries as well. But if we take a look at the languages of Europe, if we take a look at here, this is where the German-speaking people live. And you can see that it spills over into some other countries, including Austria, which is German-speaking, and Switzerland, and some other regions, a few regions of France. But you see most German-speaking people live in what we know as Germany. And then the Polish-speaking people, there's a natural break between German speakers here and Polish speakers here, and that boundary between Germany and Poland was formed to reflect the ethnic and the linguistic differences between the people there. Same with Norway and Sweden. The boundary was created to reflect the differences between Norwegian-speaking people and Swedish-speaking people. These are religious differences. So in Europe, people are predominantly Christian, but you see some religious differences between Protestant Christianity, Roman Catholic, and then over here you see a difference between the Eastern Orthodox religions and the Roman Catholic religions. And then you see some predominantly Muslim areas in the Baltic areas. And these are the actual boundaries. The last type of boundary we're going to talk about today is a superimposed boundary. So a superimposed boundary is a boundary that was forced upon its inhabitants. So a superimposed boundary can be physical, it can be cultural, and it can be geometric. However, a superimposed boundary is kind of a separate category. It's a boundary that was not created by the people who actually lived there. It was forced upon people without asking the people who lived there. And so the example here is the boundary between North and South Korea. North and South Koreans are the same ethnicity. They are the same ethnic group. They're Koreans. However, at the end of the Korean War, or near the end of the Korean War, a ceasefire was called to stop the fighting between North and South Korea. And the United Nations said that we're going to divide the peninsula of Korea into two countries, North Korea and South Korea. And we're going to divide that along the 38th parallel, or the 38th line of latitude. And so although the intent was to keep peace, it was a boundary that was forced on the people. So maybe it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but for people who fell on different sides of the boundary than they would have liked to, it did become a negative thing for many people. And then, as we talked about yesterday, many of the boundaries that were formed in much of the continent of Africa were formed at the Berlin Conference, where they formed by Europeans in order to divide up Africa into colonies. They were not, and as we talked about yesterday, the African people, the African representatives were never asked where would a good boundary be. And so the boundaries that we know today, all the white lines here are boundaries of the countries today. You can see many of these boundaries are still reminiscent, or they're still consequences of the colonies that were placed on the people. And because of that, many different ethnic groups were placed together, many different language groups were placed together. Some ethnic groups were split apart between two different countries. And it did not, these superimposed boundaries did not reflect the cultural differences. So oftentimes superimposed boundaries do not reflect the cultural differences between people. So I'm just going to pull up Google Maps really quick and just show you some more examples of boundaries. If I can get my mouse to work. Okay, so physical boundaries. If I take a look at, here's France and here's Spain. If I zoom in a little bit, there's a mountain range, and I'll turn on satellite. There's a mountain range called the Pyrenees Mountains that forms a natural break between Spain and France here. You'll also see the Alps. The Alps are a mountain range that run right here. You can see Switzerland right here, but if I go back to my regular map, you notice that the Alps also form a natural boundary between Italy and the other countries to their north. There are a number of rivers that form natural boundaries. Let's see if I can find a few here. So some rivers right here, like for example, form some boundaries between different countries. Obviously, if it's a coastline, a lot of those are going to form natural boundaries. And if I look over here, we can see the Gobi Desert a little bit better here. We can see the Himalayan mountains forming that boundary between India and China. And a number of other physical boundaries. You can see some physical boundaries in Africa, although many of them were superimposed. Rivers and lakes were used to form natural boundaries between different countries in Africa. So, for example, this boundary here between Tanzania and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And then if we go back to our map here, looking at our geometric boundaries, all of these straight lines are examples of geometric boundaries. And can we see a straight line right here? And then, yeah, so a lot of geometric boundaries here. Not too many geometric boundaries in Europe. So much of the boundaries of Europe are either physical or cultural boundaries. But you see some geometric boundaries around here, so on and so forth. And so generally geometric boundaries do not take into account the cultural differences between people. Sometimes they are colonial boundaries, sometimes they are not. But you can see the different boundaries here. So over the next couple of days, or starting the end of this week and into next week, we're going to talk about some regions of the world that have boundary conflicts, and we'll get into that on Thursday.